Good evening to everyone. Good evening to our panelists. Good evening to our viewers, and thank you for your patience with our management of technology this evening. My name is Elizabeth Prodromou, and I teach at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I'm the faculty director of the Initiative on Religion, Law and Diplomacy. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone here this evening for the fourth the final in our four-panel series on religion and peace building. This evening, the topic of our panel is religion and community, growing resilience through interfaith peace building. And we have a fantastic set of panelists and moderator discussant with us this evening. So I welcome everyone. I encourage you to visit the website for the Initiative on Religion, Law and Diplomacy. These panels are hosted by the Club on Religion, Law and Diplomacy, and tonight's panel is organized by Christopher Pomford and Lark Escobar, who are leaders in the Religion, Law and Diplomacy Club. So let me introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our distinguished speakers. And before I do that, I'm going to do one quick advertisement for the initiative. Please check our website, because on April 12th at noon, we'll be having a panel on exploring religion and violent extremisms across comparative national contexts. So for more information on that, please take a look. And now, welcoming all of our panelists this evening will be Chaplain Reverend Dr. Elise Nelson Wenger, who is the university chaplain here at Tufts University. Reverend Dr. Nelson Wenger is an ordained minister with the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and she joined Tufts University as the university chaplain in October of 2020. And we're delighted that she can introduce our speakers for this evening. Dr. Nelson Wenger brings her own impressive record of work at the intersection of religion and community, having done work on issues related to building community, interfaith peace building, and resilience in U.S. and international contexts. And I think she'll tell us more about that in her own engagement with the panelists. So I turn it over to you, Dr. Nelson Wenger, and I welcome all of our speakers this evening, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prodromou, and thank you for the honorary doctorate. I am honored to accept.
Okay. It's my pleasure to confer. Okay.
It's very fun. Well, good evening, everyone, and it's nice to see you, and I've been looking forward to this conversation and to hear how your stories and experiences both intersect and also complement this lifelong work that I trust we are each passionate about in our communities. So I want to introduce our panelists, and I was going to check and make sure I was right about pronunciation, so please correct me. Dr. Perry Halkitis, is that correct? Wonderful. Is a public health psychologist, researcher, educator, and advocate. For decades, his research has specialized on infectious diseases to determine and target the biological, behavioral, psychosocial, and structural factors that predispose HIV, HPV, COVID-19, and other pathogens. This work has further delineated the synergies of infectious disease with mental health, including drug abuse in sexual, gender, racial, and ethnic minority populations in urban centers. Throughout his career, Dr. Halkitis has been on the forefront of fighting for the rights infected with and affected by HIV, as well as being an outspoken advocate for the rights and health of the LGBTQ+ population. Dr. Halkitis is currently Dean and Professor of Biostatistics and Urban Global Public Health at the School of Public Health at Rutgers University. Dr. Halkitis is the founder and director of the Center for Health, Identity, Behavior, and Prevention Studies. Dr. Halkitis is the author of the 2019 book, Out in Time, The Public Lives of Gay Men from Stonewall to the Queer Generation. His 2013 book, The AIDS Generation, Stories of Survival and Resilience, is a 2014 Lambda Literary Award nominee. He has authored over 250 peer-reviewed academic manuscripts and actively disseminates knowledge to mainstream media, appearing frequently on television, radio, and podcasts. Welcome, Dr. Halkitis. Our second panelist is Christina Arriaga. Is that correct? So glad that you're with us. A domestic and international champion of freedom of expression and belief. In 2013, the U.S. Congress appointed her to the bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom where she was elected vice chair for 2 consecutive terms. During her 3-year tenure, she met with high-ranking government officials in Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Egypt, Nigeria, Turkey, and other countries. Arriaga also advocated for girls' and women's expressive rights, collaborating on efforts to raise awareness of these issues. Before this commission, Ms. Arriaga led Beckett Law, a nonprofit public interest law firm whose defense and eventual unanimous win before the US Supreme Court of a Muslim inmate's right to grow a beard according to his faith was featured in Time magazine. Early on in her career, Ms. Arriaga was also a member of the US delegation to the UN Human Rights Commission. In 2017, she was awarded Museum's Free Expression Award. She is a sought-after speaker and writer and has appeared on a variety of national news networks and publications. Welcome, Ms. Arriaga, excuse me. And our third panelist is Renz Argiago. Argiao.
That's Argo.
Argo.
Yes.
Thank you. My apologies. Renz Argo is the coordinator of the International Youth Committee of Religions for Peace and the director of the Argo Center for Psychological Services. A clinical psychologist by profession, he has integrated his professional work with peace-building work through the psychosocial programs he implemented to help the youth and communities affected by armed conflicts and humanitarian crises. He has organized multi-faith actions on youth empowerment, environmental protection, humanitarian response, and diversity and inclusivity. He has also convened national and international interfaith youth peace conferences and is instrumental in strengthening the interfaith youth networks in the Philippines and the Asia Pacific region. So welcome to all of you. And I know that the members of the Religion, Law, and Diplomacy Club have prepared questions and invited you to respond. And so how this panel will work this evening is to invite each of you to speak for about 15 minutes in response to those questions, and then we will have an opportunity for conversation together. So I would love to welcome Dr. Halkitis to begin.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to this panel here tonight. It is a nice way to end the day after a long, arduous day of Zooms. This is actually a nice Zoom to be on, so thank you. You're also, I will tell you also, I have just recently moved my desk to this new location. So if you like the background, give me thumbs up so I know that I can continue with it. I looked at the, thank you, Elise, for that. I had given some thought to the questions that were posed by our conveners, and also thought that it would be really important to spend some time as we start this session to talk about this whole construct of resilience and what it is. And, you know, I think it's floated around way too much. It's sort of like the word, I feel like the word nice. What does it really mean, the word nice? I have no idea what that word means, right? So the word resilience is, in my mind, also one of those words that needs some further clarification. So I'm gonna focus my remarks on that in my brief time here. So let me start by saying that the American Psychological Association, according to them, resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. Other definitions of resilience include the personal qualities that enables one to thrive in the face of adversity. Another definition is the capacity of individuals to cope successfully with significant change or adversity or risk. Because the study of resilience is considered to be an emerging field, there is not a consistent definition or conceptualization of how the construct is operationalized. Initially, most resilience-based research occurred within the field of community and developmental psychology and focused on how children with stress overcame adverse events associated with their low socioeconomic status, with severe marital discord, with parental criminality, with admission to foster care, and the like. More recently, researchers have worked to understand how childhood, familial, environmental factors, including spiritual factors, contribute to the positive outcomes associated with resilience. So resilience has been understood as a trait, as a process, an outcome, or some combination of these. And as my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, as a trait, Resilience refers to the strength of character, to determination, to grit, to resourcefulness, an innate ability or temperament that allows one to meet the challenges of life. In other words, resilience is a natural characteristic expressed via action or inaction in response to stressful situations. Other researchers similarly define resilience as a personality characteristic that moderates negative effects and promotes adaptation. Most studies that have thought about resilience in this manner have done so in examining children and looked at how adaptation to change was informed by who these children were. Resilience also, as I said earlier, has been understood as a process. The researcher Egeland and his colleagues indicate that resilience is a developmental process characterized by hierarchical integration of behavioral systems. Furthermore, they suggest that individuals participate in the process by building on historical interactions or situations to develop new attitudes, expectations, and feelings around experiences. Other researchers have suggested that resilience is likely to exist on a continuum that may present to differing degrees throughout the facets of life. So it's not an all or nothing thing. Similarly, the researchers Zatura and their colleagues indicate that resilience is best defined as an outcome of successful adaptation to adversity, and followed up with two questions in thinking about resilience. How well do people recover and bounce back from a challenge? And what is their capacity to carry forward in the face of adversity? For example, an individual who adapts well to adverse situation in the workplace or in their personal lives may fail to adapt well to a diagnosis like COVID-19 or HIV. Other ideas suggest that resilience is rooted in creating conditions that help one to self-govern and self-organize in order to be more prepared and equipped to handle a future crisis or an adverse situation. So there's like some very common themes here about adaptability, but whether one is born with it or whether one develops it or some combination of both. And I happen to believe the latter, just like eye color or height or sexual identity are these biological characteristics in which a child is born. The environment then plays a really critical role in fostering a particular characteristic. One of the challenges in researching resilience is that while there are several paradigms that examine the foundational underpinnings, many of them focus on specific populations or fields, for example, adolescents, families, medical students, rather than across populations. However, the researcher Richardson and his colleagues have outlined a three-stage model of resiliency that cuts across the paradigm, including resilient qualities, the resilient process, and innate resilience, all of which constitute their meta-theory of resilience and resiliency. The theory is of particular importance because it can be applied to different analytic levels: the individual, the familial, and the community. And I think we'll be talking a lot about the latter tonight, and across different types of adverse life stressors and events. Moreover, it encompasses a wide range of ideas stemming from psychology, but also from physics, from philosophy, and from medicine, and may be a step towards achieving consensus across populations. Here is where faith and organized religion may play a role in thinking about resilience. Richardson, another colleague, describes the concept of biopsychospiritual homeostasis as the adapted state of spirit, body, and mind, where at a given point in time, an individual can adapt and overcome a set of good or bad circumstances through physical, mental, or spiritual means. External stressors, life prompts, adversity, and other forms of change often test this homeostasis, but through the process of developing resilient qualities, individuals are able to maintain it. Richardson's model is not without its faults. Its linear design does not take into account multiple stressors. Furthermore, it has a bias towards coping-oriented processes. Other researchers like Fletcher and Sarkar argue that the aforementioned limitations warrant new theories of resilience that are supported by original empirical studies. In addition to all of this lack of consistency of thinking about what resilience is, there's also different ways in which it is measured. So much of my work has focused on two populations, older adults and the LGBTQ population. I just want to comment briefly on these. As I said earlier, many studies have focused historically on children, adolescents, and veterans who have exposed and prolonged exposure to trauma and other chronic stressors. More recently, a growing body of research has emerged examining resilience among older adults and its role in the successful aging process. While successful aging can have several components, it has been defined as freedom from disability and chronic disease, as well as high mental and physical functioning. Being resilient later in life has been associated with reduced levels of depression and risk of mortality, as well as increased quality of life and improved lifestyle behaviors. In one study, the researcher Hassani, in a study of older adults suffering from chronic disease, found that improvements in resilience were patient-centered, with a patient-centered, found improvements in resilience in patients with a patient-centered approach after their diagnosis. More specifically, participants in their study described personal experiences of resilience as an art of overcoming pain and suffering while adapting to life with chronic diseases and processes and overall senescence. So I think with these ideas, we start to get to this notion of, some of the underpinnings of like religious philosophies and values that talk about how we cope with life's adversities and manage life adversities and integrate life's adversities and come out of it in a better place. In the population that I study, which is LGBTQ individuals, those individuals face lifelong stigma, discrimination, and other experiences that lead to adverse psychosocial outcomes. The last 4 years under the previous presidential administration has been a nightmare for us. We have been cast aside. Our rights have been chipped away. And fortunately, there's a new day in this country. While these experiences may have been painful to endure, it is important to acknowledge they do not always result in ongoing suffering or psychopathology. Frequently, older adults have a greater deal of resistance and resilience around the negative experience associated with identifying LGBTQ, which has led to an emerging body of research focusing on resilience in this population that is a positive psychological approach. And I think that for too long, when we've looked at the work of LGBTQ health, it's always been about what the population has done wrong. Well, they have AIDS and they have like endless partnerings and there's substance use. But for every small proportion of the population that those behaviors represent, the majority of the population is quite successful, quite resilient, quite active in their citizenship, many very active in their religious communities, very spiritual in their lives. And so looking at this on the flip side is really critically important. Several studies of older LGBTQ adults have found high degrees of involvement within the LGBT community and robust social networks among the population. And my friend Mark Brennan and his colleagues found that 77% of a Chicago-based sample reported having a functional friend with an average of 4.1 friends and 10.6 individuals in their social circle, meaning that LGBTQ people establish these circles around them that also feed into their resilience. It would be remiss, as I stated earlier, not to mention that in light of the overwhelming political and social discrimination faced by many LGBTQ older adults, members from the generation have been very active in fighting for equality and rights of the modern LGBTQ movement. Through their activism, they built strategies to endure and to overcome the many obstacles they face. They built resilience. And I want to just leave you with one quote from a participant who I interviewed for a previous project, who talked about their social activism and how that social activism was critical to understanding themselves, but also to building their resilient nature. And this participant said, "A lot of my activism work since I've become an activist has been definitely contributed to my resilience, because you know that you can work on something and put your heart and soul into it, and then it doesn't work. It beats you up and dies on you. And you know, there's all these good things and there's all these bad things that happen. Being an activist is like being on a roller coaster at Six Flags. There's this major ups and downs, emotional highs and lows that is just beyond the normal life. And it's about, because you're seeing things that are not just important to you, but important to other people that are your friends and people that you don't even know. This quote embodies resilience, I think, because it highlights the need to keep moving forward despite the negative experiences, especially because others can be impacted in ways unbeknownst to this person, to other activists. And so I leave you with that quote, and I look forward to our further discussion on the matters of resilience and community building. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you have rooted us well in the research and the study of resilience. Thank you so much, and more. But I would like to now move to Ms. Arriaga.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. As Perry said, it's so great to be here and after a long day of Zoom calls. Although I must say that when I told my husband I was speaking after Perry, he said he's such a tough act to follow, and I do believe that. So thank you for having me on. And thank you, Professor Perdomo, my colleague and friend, for including me in this panel. The population I study in my academic work is the population of women, particularly women in Latin America. So after surveying these questions that were so thoughtfully asked and worded, I wanted to talk specifically about what has happened in Latin America to women during the pandemic and how religious communities have stepped in to build resilience. In Colombia, for instance, in August of 2020, calls to the line 155, which is like the 911 for reporting domestic violence, had an increase of 228% just on the first 3 months of the pandemic. 228%. So you can only imagine what happened afterwards. In Peru, during the quarantine, over 900 women disappeared, 70% of them minors. And before COVID, Peru had a terrible, dismal figures associated with disappearances of women. There were 5 disappearances per day. COVID added another 3. And again, I cannot underscore this enough, 70% of them were minors. The economic situation for women in Latin America has also been terrible during the pandemic. Female workers were 44% more likely than male workers to lose their jobs at the beginning of the crisis. And studies reveal that women who are out of the workforce and are forced to stay at home not only face an increased workload and economic uncertainty, but they also have a much higher risk of domestic violence. This is even worse for women who are indigenous, rural, or are descendants of African countries. And they have felt, these 3 minority communities, that they have had less information, less access to healthcare, and less resources, and their situation was already stark. So what has been the role of religious communities, and how does their involvement affect resilience? If I were to summarize the role of religious communities in all countries, but I'm going to put Brazil aside, I would group them in 3 distinct but interrelated categories, and those are decoders, validators of information, and communities that are offering infrastructural support. So let me define each one of these categories, and let me give you an example throughout Latin America. First of all, for instance, in a place like Buenos Aires, pastors in low-income sectors stated specifically that they were decoding the scientific and technical knowledge of government agencies and translating them into layman terms to their communities. I like what a Nicaraguan pastor said during an interview. He said, "We're not doctors, but we guide our followers to comply with the recommendations of the Ministry of Health." And then he added, "to protect themselves from evil." And I love that he used that term, and I'm gonna talk about that term later on. In Argentina, for instance, the way the religious communities and the government work, there was an alliance of Interfaith alliance formed by the evangelical church. And what they did is they function as a bridge from the Ministry of Health to the communities. The same was done in Panama, where the evangelical communities were communicating guidelines issued by the Ministry of Health to people in their communities. So the second interrelated function of these religious communities is validators. And if you step back, if you look at evolutionary cognitive theory, we know that we as human beings are more likely to believe a friend than believe a stranger, even if presented with the same facts. Why is this? Because we know that our brain evolved to survive, and in order to survive, we want to stay in a group. And people are embraced or condemned according to their belief system. So one function of the mind is actually to hold on to those beliefs that makes us part of a tribe, that makes us have the greater number of allies or disciples, rather than factoring logic or beliefs that are most likely to be true. So pastors in this sense have a dramatic effect on credibility because they have a moral authority. They understand the daily dramas of everyone who attends their church. Or in the words of Jonathan Haidt, the renowned moral evolutionary psychologist, he says, morality binds and blinds. So remember earlier when I said that one of the pastors talked about telling that he was talking to his parishioners, to the members of his church, so they would stay away from evil. Note that he's using moral language to talk about the pandemic. That was moral language was also used in many other countries for many reasons, but in this case, the pastor is using it in a way that resonates with his communities. We know from other studies that this is important because communities develop idiosyncratic systems of hierarchy of morals. In other words, one thing is much more important than the other if the entire community believes this. We have seen them in other cases, for instance, in studies on female genital mutilation cutting. In those studies, even when medical authorities speak to mothers and explain the horrible side effects of cutting their girls, psychological and health-wise, mothers understand but are reluctant to stop the practice because their whole community believes it's a good practice. So you always need, in order to work with communities, multi-dimensional ways of approaching the communities. So it's been particularly important to these communities that the religious authorities have been validating and giving credibility to the facts that they have been receiving from the government communities. The third way that religious communities have been assisting in Latin America, particularly for women, is infrastructural support. So for instance, in El Salvador, which is an impoverished country with a largely non-functioning government, pastors around the country organize, and when I talk about pastors, by the way, I'm talking about all religions, houses of worship, leaders of houses of worship got together and they offered their school and infrastructures to have additional beds, to have additional places where food could be distributed. In Peru, the church there, which is a little bit stronger than the one in El Salvador, provided volunteers to work along the Ministry of Health in hospitals. And we know that resilience is affected, as Perry so eloquently said, by the people that are around you and support you. Coping mechanisms are important in hospitals, and they are not only about survival. In Costa Rica and Honduras, churches also gave supplies to public hospitals because the government could not give enough PPE equipment for the medical practitioners in all these places. And in Argentina, pastoralists, pastors who worked in rural areas, in agricultural communities, provided food to the government so it could be redistributed. And the list goes on. But we can see that the religious community is partnering with the secular structures in order to provide these three areas. First of all, the spread of information, the validation of the information, as well as the infrastructure. Now, I left Brazil aside because even though most of Latin American countries align themselves with the World Health Organization criteria for the management of the pandemic and recognize its severity, Brazil was led by someone who did not want to talk about COVID in real terms for political reasons. And in Venezuela, the same thing happened. And in fact, Maduro has been banned from several social platforms just last week because of his spreading misinformation about COVID. I don't think that anyone can doubt that Latin American women were disproportionately affected by the pandemic relative to other Latin American populations. But in the question of resilience, I think it remains to be seen. I too attempted to struggle with the definition of resilience, and I think that Perry did a fantastic job talking about how resilience has many different facets. But particular to Latin America, several studies on cancer patients, hip replacements, as well as mental illnesses have revealed that spirituality has an important cultural value, and that individuals that have access to aspects of their spirituality, particularly prayer and community, and the idea that God is watching over them, have a better index of being able to cope with devastating illness or even mental health. And I do want to close on a positive note to say that the multi-dimensional crisis that has been caused in Latin America for women is a great opportunity for the region to reshape its women's role when it comes to economy, to politics, to society, but also for the churches to realize that in strengthening women in their community, they're strengthening their entire community. In many of these communities, religious authorities are largely patriarchal, and this hopefully will present an opportunity for these patriarchal leadership to also spread the news, validate, and be an infrastructure for the courageous women in their communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And let's continue on with Mr. Argo. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me in this panel. Greetings from the Philippines. I'm happy to be with you from the other side of the world, where it's currently 6 in the morning. But the discussions are waking me up at this very early hour here. And our discussions on resilience are very timely, especially as we all try to survive during this COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Halkitis already shared how resilience is defined in the field of psychology. So I would just like to use the same definitions as I come from the same field. One additional definition I like comes from Dr. Catherine Panter-Brick, who defined resilience as a process to harness resources to sustain well-being. And I would like to focus my brief remarks on how we integrated religion, peace building, and resilience in our work with the youth. I often use the metaphor of the bamboo whenever we talk about resilience. Here in the Philippines, we experience more than 20 typhoons every year. And whenever typhoons hit our islands, we can see how strong winds would blow on the bamboos, causing them to bend but not to break. As the typhoon ceases and when the winds calm down, the bamboo returns to its upright position. The bamboo is able to cope and be flexible in the face of adversity, and it stands firmly. So we always use this in helping Filipinos understand this important concept on resilience. When we look at the nexus of religion and resilience, in many studies in psychology, religion is already seen as one of the factors that builds and enhances resilience. In fact, studies show that religiousness itself is resilient to major life stressors. What this means is that religion is effective in helping people sustain their relationships with the sacred and the divine. And I have personally witnessed that. In 2011, a tropical storm Washi caused massive flooding in Mindanao, South Island of the Philippines. Our weather bureau recorded around 18.7 inches of rain in a 24-hour span that caused our rivers to rise and leading to floods of about 23 to 30 feet high. Over 1,100 people died and around 700,000 people were displaced. I was with a team of Religions for Peace Philippines who responded to the crisis, and we conducted psychosocial processing to the survivors. I would never forget a conversation I had with one of the youth survivors. His faith was so strong despite losing his home, their livelihood, and his father and a sibling. He held on to his faith to get him through. I asked him, "How can you keep your faith in times like this?" He answered me, "This experience is already difficult enough now that I believe in God. What more if I didn't? How much more if I didn't have my faith to hold on to?" Filipinos are very religious, and you can see that as we prepare for every typhoon or calamity. We would always hear prayers in our community that are shared or even recited to help protect us from any disaster. Right now, every day you can hear prayers to protect us from the COVID-19 pandemic. And religion has been one of the many factors that really strengthened our resilience. However, in some areas, religion can also be a vulnerability and it can exacerbate life stressors. In the same way that religion becomes a source of hope, meaning, peace, comfort, and forgiveness, religion can also be a source of guilt, hatred, or confusion. As such, careful integration of religion should be done when responding to humanitarian crisis. But let us focus on the positive interaction between religion and resilience. More importantly, on how interfaith initiatives can help build resilient communities. Over 80% of the world's population identify with a religion. In the psychological sciences, we already have shown evidence that religion contributes to the development of resilience by being a source of hope and comfort, both of which are important in sustaining well-being during times of crisis. Most religion talk about forgiveness, which is cathartic and can help individuals have closure and move forward. They help give meaning to the people's experiences, allowing them to view negative experiences in a more positive way, or at least in ways that they are able to live with their own experiences. Interfaith initiatives allow people to come together, share their lived experiences, and offer support to one another. And in interfaith initiatives on humanitarian crisis have also shown success in helping individuals and communities recover quickly. In our work here in the Philippines, we have tapped on our interfaith networks whenever we conduct psychosocial support programs to the communities affected by several typhoons. Some of the most notable typhoons, calamities that we have worked on include Super Typhoon Haiyan, which left thousands dead and about 6 million people displaced in the central islands of the Philippines. Our partners from various interfaith organizations, dioceses, religious communities came together to share resources and skills to support the survivors. One of the major projects that we conducted was a psychosocial rehabilitation of a whole village, which was successfully conducted through the help of our interfaith networks. In our peace building work, we also focus on our psychosocial support and resilience building with our projects with the youth, women, and religious leaders in the armed conflict areas in the central Mindanao region. This region in the south of the Philippines have experienced decades-long armed conflicts. And as part of our contribution towards sustainable peace in the region, we focus on a two-pronged approach. First, heal the trauma from the war, and second, to build on individual and community resilience. So we started with healing the trauma that the youth, women, indigenous people, and even the military experienced during the war. In our project Counseling for Peace, we saw the importance of healing the trauma in order to achieve lasting peace. In the words of Dr. Lilian Sison, the Secretary General of Religions for Peace Philippines, she said that healing is an essential element of and a precondition towards dialogue. And we were proud as our project was then the first to bring Christians, Muslims, and indigenous people under one roof, something that was not possible during that time because of the mistrust that they had from people from other religions. So we saw a transformation of how survivors perceive the other people from different religions. So we saw it from the transformation, no? From seeing them as enemies to seeing them as their neighbors and their partners. Our approach to developing resilience was through capacity building and community organizing. We trained the youth as peer supporters so they may be able to provide psychosocial support to their fellow youth survivors. We also trained women and religious leaders on mental health and psychosocial support so they may be able to provide help to those who need it. Through community organizing, we created interfaith women and youth networks, and these networks are now our frontline responders whenever needed. We tapped on the influence of religious leaders that they have over their community in bringing their people together and in mobilizing them towards crisis response. The partnerships between religious communities, faith-based organizations, and local communities ensure that the resources that are needed are available. We even got the military involved and helped them to develop better community relations. The youth were also trained on how to build networks and coalitions who will work together towards supporting their fellow youth and their communities. Apart from healing their emotional wounds, we also educated them on the value of peace and harmony. With their new knowledge, they themselves went to their friends, schools, families, and communities and shared what they have learned. And in their own ways, they were able to transform a culture of vengeance to a culture of forgiveness. So this model that we use to respond to armed conflicts and disasters was replicated in our responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. We worked with our interfaith partners in delivering assistance in the form of food, health and sanitation packs, and informational materials to various communities. Our youth network initiated online campaigns to spread awareness on preventing the spread of the virus and how to promote and sustain well-being during the pandemic and how faith can strengthen resilience. We worked with religious leaders to ensure that we create safe spaces to talk about how the pandemic affected the youth's mental health. The strength of our Interfaith initiative was rooted in our shared resources, allowing us to reach out to those who are vulnerable and in need. I would like to proudly share that we have accomplished much with so little resources, and grassroots movements provided the needed human resources we needed to implement the projects. Since they are deeply involved in their own communities, it was easy to organize them in ways that are non-intrusive and in ways that promote solidarity. Global high-level religious leaders have influence in terms of values and principles, but grassroots movements have influence because of their own involvement in the community. They live and breathe with these communities, and they can easily win the trust and support of the people. While senior religious leaders provide inspiration, it is these grassroots movements that empower and move individuals towards actions. In my over a decade of working with our interfaith youth networks, I have seen the value of instilling hope among young people. That hope serves as a fuel to the fire to their passion to make this world a better place. All over the world, we have witnessed young people leading movements and coalitions to advance inclusive peace and sustainable development. Today's generation of youth, the largest the world has ever witnessed, is equipped with resources and is empowered to take actions to transform the future of humanity. We have our perspectives on the issues and can provide solutions to address them. We have witnessed so much human suffering, and now we have a much better vision of the kind of world that we want to live in. The wisdom handed to us and the values instilled within us resulted in our diverse perspectives. Our connectedness allowed us to care for everyone, even the least of us. We now have a generation of youth that is not just the hope of the future, but we often say now that they are also the hope of the present. What I learned in my interfaith work towards peace building is the value of knowing what peace means to people. With young people I have worked with, peace can mean differently. It is more than just the absence of war. And some of the people I have worked with, the young people I've asked, peace for some of them meant being able to go to school or to be able to play in their own neighborhoods or to have meals on their tables. I saw peace in the face of a young child who was able to wave and smile through passing vehicles on the road, something that they were not able to do for a long time due to the war. So in leading our communities towards peace, we must start with what peace means for the people in these communities. Let us be mindful of finding them where they are so we can lead them to where they want to be. Let us use our religions, our faith, our beliefs, our values, and nurturing resilience in each of us. And in these trying times, many people have their faith to hold on to, so let us not let them lose that. So let us build safe spaces for our own religious communities and be that safe space for everyone. So thank you very much, and may peace be upon you all.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by noting the, I think, powerful similarities in terms of your comments today. And that is that resilience is built when people are meeting human need in the moment, and that religious communities are effective and even liberatory and transformative when they are seeing human beings in their moment of need and responding to that. And Dr. Halkitis, you were talking about the social activism and the challenge of social justice work, but that people are in it because they see human need, they know it goes up and down, but there's purpose in that. Mm-hmm. And connecting and understanding that resilience is built when we have lives of meaning and purpose, and can see one another through that. And I was thinking about the youth work that you were just describing, Mr. Argo, and a lot of the interfaith work that is happening on college campuses in the United States starts in the same place, with a desire to come together of shared values, and to work for the common good. And through that work, whether it can be making a dinner together with, at a soup kitchen. It can be working on building a house for Habitat for Humanity, which is really important community work, but it's also about building relationships of trust with one another, and then being able to really see and appreciate the distinctiveness of one another's beliefs, and also the ways in which we can learn from one another. To start off, I would like to ask a question to Ms. Arriaga, you ended by talking about the power of the women of Latin America and this opportunity now for religious traditions, many of which are patriarchal, which are male-led and male-dominated, which also are often accompanied by certain teachings and expectations around women's health. What would you like to see? What do you think would be a liberatory message for the churches that you've described in order to support the full power and flourishing of women in those contexts?
I'd love to see more dialogue. And let me be clear. If a community decides that its hierarchy is going to consist of men, they should be able to do so, but women should be able to stay in that community and accept that belief system or leave. And in many communities in Latin America, that possibility of changing one's mind or converting to another religion or deciding that this church no longer fits the expectations, they like no longer exists because the community social networks are so tightly tied to the religious values of the community. So starting with a dialogue, a genuine, robust dialogue between the hierarchs and the women in the church, it would be a terrific way of beginning to listen to each other. I've been in the religious freedom business for 25 years, and I do think that government intervention in religious structures is generally negative. But I do think that intra-religious dialogue and facilitating the space for that interreligious dialogue can yield a lot of good and can transform what are somewhat stagnant identities of the role of women in the church, which sometimes is reflected the role of women in the family, in our home, and in the workplace. It's a difficult question to tackle without being intrusive into belief systems, but also one that, when explored, can yield excellent results. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and I wonder too if the resilience of women who are working and living and parenting and contributing in their communities, lifting up their voices to speak for themselves, to share what they need and want, and in terms of their spirituality is a way to do that as well. To listen to women. And to know that that being listened to can build resiliency as well.
Yes. Genuinely listening is deceptively simple sometimes, but that is something that a true leader of a religious community will try to insist on in his religious community, in his religious leadership.
That's right. This is actually, go ahead.
Reverend, can I add something to that? I think also I feel like women are remarkable. Female identified individuals are remarkable. Actually, much better than men, I would actually say. I think about what's happened over the COVID pandemic over the course of the last year in the United States, when I think about mothers working with their children at home and often being the caregiver and the meal maker and all of that, right? And it's just, to me, a testament. I think about the very strong Greek women that I was raised by, right? And, the role that they played in my life and my upbringing. I do challenge my colleague, though, in one regard, which is I think that, it is incumbent upon religious leaders to treat all of their parishioners, people in mosques, people in synagogues, people in churches equally, whether they're male identified or female identified. And I think the religion has organized religion has a very important role to play in making sure that every human being is treated equally and with equal respect and is given equal voice, and that the hierarchy, which is an artificial one, is eliminated, as you say, Christina, through dialogue, right? But it ultimately is eliminated.
Dr. Prodromou has submitted a question that I actually think goes really well with this conversation. So I'm going to offer it up. She asks, what can community leaders do to build sustainable communities that global high-level religious leaders cannot? Anyone can respond.
Well, I want to add one more thing about the church, because I think it speaks to Elizabeth's question. So I don't know if you're all watching the documentary on PBS about the Black church and how incredibly remarkable and important the Black church was, right? So the Black church is not just about the Black church, right? It's about social justice and about political rights and about activism and all of those things, and about music and all of those things. So to Elizabeth's question, which is a superb question, what community leaders need to do is ensure that they engage with the decision makers of their societies, whether it be like academics like me or politicians like our mayor, to have their voices heard. You know, we've been building here in Newark, which is where my home is during the week, this paradigm that says if we want the health of the people in Newark to improve, people like me don't go in there and just dump stuff into the community. We listen, as Christina said, like right from the beginning, listen to what community members are saying, what communities of leaders are wishing for, and then give them the tools, because they often don't have the tools that we have to be able to enact the change. We have the social capital, right? We have the academic capital, and it's our job to transfer that capital to the community to help them build make these changes.
Yeah, I agree with Perry. If I may, all politics are, and Elizabeth's question is so important. All politics are local, right? So for someone from way up to decide what a community needs, it's artificial. Now, I disagree a little bit with Perry on the equality issue, or perhaps the way I heard it. There's a lot of talk about, when you talked about, Perry mentioned, like, what does the word nice mean? What does the word resilience mean? Well, what does the word equal mean? And what does the word discrimination mean? When I hear younger people in lectures say there should never be discrimination, I'm like, I disagree. I cannot sing to save my life. So this is a hypothetical, but let's say I'm a wonderful singer and I go into an Orthodox Jewish church and I demand to be the cantor. It's okay for the Orthodox Jewish church to say it has to be a Jew and it has to be a man, and it's okay for the government to protect that. So I understand the concept of equality, Perry, that I think you're talking about, which is without regard to gender. But I also think that it's okay for churches to decide what their values are going to be. And it's okay for the individuals in those churches to decide, I'm going to stay because I agree, or I'm going to leave because I disagree. I
don't want the person to become the cantor, but I want the woman to be equal to the man and be seen as God has created man equal to woman, that they are treated equally. I feel like Renz wants to say something and he wants to pop in. So I'm gonna stop myself here, or we're gonna just debate for the next half hour.
I was actually enjoying that discussion regarding equality and religion, because one thing about discrimination is that it's very important also to understand, based from theological foundations, on what discrimination means differently for different religions. While we speak about equality on gender, for example, some religious leaders may not see it as discrimination because based on their religious context and their theological teachings, if they treat men and women differently, that is what their religion, what their beliefs are teaching them. So I agree with Christina there that for some, they may not see that as discrimination. Although again, in a different context of how we really want to have equality, it's quite difficult to push that, especially for conservative traditional religious leaders who still believe that their own practices on how they implement equality is different from how many of us would see that on a more liberal view. But to go back to the question on how community leaders or organizers differ from high-level religious leaders, working with both levels in our work in Religions for Peace. High-level global religious leaders do have influence in terms of policy development. We saw that. We see how they engage in faith-based diplomacy, how they have caused influence and significant changes on many global policies and advancing some of agenda globally. But when you go to the grassroots communities, these are not often felt. Although they have the influence, they are not really embedded in what is happening in their own communities. So sometimes they don't know what the community needs. And it has been pointed out a while ago that it is very important to listen to these communities. Otherwise, you will not be able to do what they need. And I mentioned a while ago that in my work, I realized the different meaning of peace to people. Before I started peace work, all I thought of was that peace is the absence of war. But and my idea is that if I go to a community and I want to build peace, I should stop war. But in some areas that I've worked with, they conceptualize peace as being able to go to work or being able to go to school or being able to play. And when I understood the context of what peace meant in that community, it was a lot easier for me to move the people, to work with the people towards peace. And sometimes that's where the gap comes in. Okay, for high level religious leaders, oftentimes they're no longer connected with what the people needs. So I think the strength of community leaders, grassroots movements, really is that connection, that involvement with their communities that helps them bring to the community what they need. And I also point out the value of giving those resources to them and strengthening their skills so that they're able to respond to their own needs. That's all.
Thank you, Dr. Argo. There's actually a question for you in the chat from a participant, Sophia Kairu, who that again builds on what you were just saying. She says, us about if you have seen any differences between rural versus urban and peri-urban approaches to community resilience. Are faith-based communities better in one or the other context? And do they approach cooperation with public health and or gender inclusive organizations differently depending on being rural, urban, or peri-urban?
In my experience, mostly for rural communities, that's where you see the strength of faith and spirituality and religion. And in urban communities here, it's usually a bit, it's not as strong as you would see in rural areas. For many of our rural communities, you can see that faith-based organizations actually have more influence in them. They're able to mobilize them better as compared to how faith-based organizations would work in urban communities here. So we usually see that kind of difference because those in the rural communities are often more rooted in traditional beliefs that they have, and they still very much involved with their own faith traditions. While mostly in urban communities that we have worked in, the work, basically the movements, their focus is then on the public health issues instead of focusing on how faith and resilience is involved. In terms of cooperation, public health, and gender inclusive organizations, the work mostly on urban communities here advances really gender inclusive organizations work best in our own urban communities as compared to faith-based communities, especially on concepts like, for example, when we were talking about discrimination and inequality, usually there is a difficulty in bringing that idea in rural communities. But when faith-based organizations are involved, the rural communities usually are more connected to their faith leaders as compared to those in urban communities. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Dr. Halkitis, Ahmed has a question. Wondering if you could tell us about the intersection of religious communities and public health providers when it comes to reducing mutual suspicion and or negative perceptions about cooperation and therefore contribution to resilience. And that reminds me of what Ms. Arriaga was saying about the role of religious communities to be decoders, connectors. What do you see in your context?
Yeah, so what I see it really, really, really strongly right now with COVID-19 and the Black populations of New Jersey. So there's, as the Black population rightfully has enormous mistrust of the medical profession, years and years, let's say 402 years of like oppression and discrimination and racism and, horrific experimentation on the population and the lack of treatment, effective treatment by the healthcare providers. So, you come to this conversation about COVID-19 vaccine with lots of different people being hesitant. Not only the Black population, those Republican white men are hesitant to, but for very different reasons, right? But the Black population actually has a real reason to be concerned, which is like they've been mistreated. The white straight Republican men have not been mistreated, despite what they may think. I'm sorry I'm being political, I just have to be. So what I see is this enormous stepping up of the church. In this case, it's the church in New Jersey to really engage with its parishioners to, one, understand the importance of this vaccine, two, to build trust in it, but three, what I love the most, to provide the vaccine. And so like I've been saying from the very beginning of this epidemic, we have to take care and vaccination to people. And the roles that churches and mosques and synagogues and other places of worship can play is that they can become, as Bren said, I think they can become community centers and religious centers and public health centers all together. And I think we tend to, in our society, want to put things in silos, right? So this is politics, this is religion, this is academics, this is public health. But if we start to think holistically about places of worship as places that deliver food and deliver care and deliver services, then they have a very big role to play in, one, delivering healthcare, but also in building the resilience and strength that the people need in order to have the fortitude and grit to fight through this horrific disease and to fight through their fears of this particular vaccination, because we're all living in this like uncertain world that, quite frankly, to me, as a young man who grew up in New York City in the 1980s, feels like that all over again, like this unknown virus in our mix creating chaos. So I think religious centers are enormously important, and our governor gets it here in New Jersey, Governor Murphy. He really understands the role that these institutions can play. I hope that answers the question.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think about young people, many who I know, that's what they expect. If religion is going to be relevant and religious communities, they need to be meeting human need. They need to be delivering the food and marching in the streets for the worth and dignity and rights of all people. That's people come together across religious and philosophical lines to do that. I think that's really exciting, because I think that can help sustain and transform religious communities for a new generation. I would like to continue with, we have more great questions for our panel. Ahmed also says, thank you for the conceptually and empirically rich presentations and for helping us to understand the complex concept of resilience. And this is for anyone on the panel. Could you give us a sense, based on your experience, if religious leaders and public health leaders and humanitarian providers are engaged in this dialogue about the meaning of resilience? More specifically, do you see purposeful discussions and collaborative action across these sectors, religious and non-religious, when it comes to understanding and building resilience?
So Renz knows this, that our field, psychology, was the one who came up with this notion of resilience. And we've been talking about it for like 20 something years. The public health people are just getting onto this idea of resilience. That's my one comment.
I'm going to offer a brief response to that, only because I've been thinking about the role of spiritual practices, and you mentioned this, Dr. Halkitis, for building resilience. And in the tradition I know best, which is the Lutheran Christian tradition, I think about the weekly liturgy, which is similar to other Christian liturgies, but and other forms of worship and other traditions, where it's about this weekly gathering where you come together with your community to tell the truth about who you are, about your brokenness, to hear words of grace and promise, to wrestle with scripture and listen for the Spirit in this time, receive communion, and then be sent out again in service, to do justice and love kindness. And this happens week after week to spiritually build that resilience. But I don't think we talk about it in the theological world. I don't know if you see that, Renz, conversations among clergy and religious leaders talking about the spiritual practices that foster resilience.
Well, to be honest, I actually haven't seen much of the discussion on religious leaders when it comes to resilience. I think, as Dr. Halkit has mentioned, that some the public health sectors, for example, are just getting on in this concept of resilience. And every time we talk about the role of religious leaders, for example, in mental health in particular, it's still quite difficult to push to them the value of discussions on mental health. We often tell them that they need to stop spiritualizing what is psychological, for example, because in many spaces, whenever we talk about mental health, it is always a question of religion for them. Some believing that you're not resilient simply because you don't believe in God, or you don't follow a particular religion, or you don't practice your religion, which is obviously two totally different things. So in terms of how religious leaders are involved, I think I haven't really seen a lot of discussions or dialogue about resilience.
Well, recently there was if I may,
Yes, I just wanted to call on you, please. Sorry.
Actually, the International Orthodox Christian Charities, which is the humanitarian arm of the Orthodox Church, created a series of modules on resilience and how they came at it from all sorts of disciplines and perspectives. And it's such a natural connection, right? One of the greatest books on resilience, without using the word resilience, is Man's Search for Meaning. The idea that Jews who were undergoing the horrible treatment in the Holocaust, the individuals who found meaning in their suffering, the individuals who found meaning, religious meaning, were able to survive horrible atrocities, and people who couldn't find meaning were not able to do so. So I think it is a natural link, but to your point, I think it would be terrific for our religious leaders and communities to be talking about resilience. Also, unfortunately, the word trauma has become such a negative word in society. If you suffer trauma, you're automatically a victim. If you suffer trauma, you're never going to overcome. And I think talking about resilience makes us understand that adversity it doesn't have to be devastating all the time. It can make us much stronger than we were before. It can lift us up. And unfortunately, we have developed this whole idea that if you're a kid, you have to be in a pavement that's covered with rubber, so you cannot even scrape your knee, and that in school you cannot hear certain ideas because they might hurt you or remind you of bad things. And Anne Lamott, the Christian writer, has this saying that I will paraphrase: my mind is a terrible place where I would rather not be alone. I don't want to be the only person in my mind. I want a community of people. I want to be exposed to new ideas. And that is what resilience is about. It's developing coping mechanisms, not letting that trauma become so definitive in your life that it defines everything and it defines who you are.
Can I tag on to that? Because a little trauma is a good thing. I will agree with you. And a little test anxiety is a good thing. And there's a substantial amount of literature to indicate that a little test anxiety leads to better performance on examinations, and some trauma in life, adversity leads to resilience. I'm there. And the literature, Christina, is all about that. I think the problem is, for most folks, when that line is crossed and the trauma is so overwhelming that it interferes with any ability to be resilient. So, I will do the work that I know, which is like, the young gay man who's called horrible names in the playground. That's one thing. And I was called those names. And then there's the young gay man who's beat up and smacked and emotionally abused by his father because of his gay identity. That's a different thing. That second child is not going to become resilient.
Trauma, you're right, but trauma and abuse are different. And that definitional line is one where we need to have a dialogue, but we cannot resort to all or nothing either. So you're right, the pendulum swings both ways. And the same thing, religious freedom in the United States. Granted, a lot of people suffer from religious freedom. You could lose your job. You can be beheaded in the Middle East. It doesn't make the suffering of the person of religious freedom in the United States less valid. It just makes it so that
different.
different, very
Yeah.
different.
Yeah. Reverend, can I offer a metaphor for your example? Because I think I have a good metaphor. I wrote somewhere once that building resilience is like building a muscle. So to me, going to church is like a muscle. It's like the gym for resilience. Like you go there every week to become even more resilient.
I love that. I'll remember that. Thank you. Christina, I wanted to ask a question coming from Christopher. In your experience working in U.S. government, do you feel that the U.S. can or should play a role in helping international communities become more resilient by supporting and strengthening local religion? And do you have any experiences to share on this subject?
Absolutely. We have a responsibility as a rich, privileged country, and what I believe to be the freest country in the world, to help other nations fulfill their obligations under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Elizabeth was a commissioner as well. I was a commissioner on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I traveled the world, as you mentioned, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the exchange of ideas, the exchange of supporting minority religious groups is one that is crucial for the survival of our own freedom and for the survival of minority religious communities all over the United States. It's heartbreaking that the birthplace of Christianity will have no Christians very, very soon. It's a travesty that the Yazidis, who survived thousands and thousands of, well, not that 1,000 years, that survived 2,000 years, have perished under ISIS. It's a tragedy that there's 7 Jews left in Egypt. There's 7, they're probably 6 by now. And there's 6 Jews left in Alexandria. I mean, there's a whole biblical passage of Jews making it through Egypt, and all of these communities have been obliterated precisely because of tribal thinking, because of of believing that that's the other, and believing that these communities do not deserve to exist. So how can the United States help? And here I will get very specific. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom is an independent agency that makes recommendations to the Department of State on whether countries should be sanctioned or not, whether countries should be incentivized in certain matters or not. And the Department of State takes on those recommendations and decides what to do about it and make recommendations to the president. Look what's going on right now in China with the Uyghurs, with the Muslim communities that are native to China, and it's a genocide. It's a genocide. And the word genocide was used too late by the United States. And as a result, the Chinese, not as a result of the United States, but the Chinese have been getting away with this for a long time. And there should be an embargo. There should be measures. Only recently was the Magnitsky Act applied to the Chinese officers who are responsible for that horrible, horrible incident. The Magnitsky Act, which exists, I believe right now in 33 countries, what it does, it penalizes individuals who are involved in the abuse of human rights. And the reason this was created was because this accountant, uncovered this horrible act of corruption and the Russians incarcerated him and murdered him for doing so. So this Magnitsky Act is in his name, and the person who is behind these efforts discovered that many autocrats from China, from Cuba, from Turkey were sending their kids and their families to shop for Christmas in the United States and bring money to the United States. They were sending their kids to universities in the United States without any consequences. So understanding that this should not happen, US Congress passed this. But it's up to the Department of Treasury, it's up to the Department of State to push. So these individuals are never allowed to have the privileges that they don't allow their own population to have. So sorry about the impassioned answer, but I feel very strongly that individuals who violate human rights in their own countries should never be allowed to enjoy the freedoms that they deny their own populations.
Thank you. It's very appropriate given that we're with the Religious Law and Diplomacy Club. and thinking about what is the role of diplomacy in protecting freedom of religious expression. And thank you for sharing those examples. Let me ask another question that gets us back to, Renz, you've talked about how peace means different things to different people, and you figure that out by actually asking them to do that. And we've been talking a lot about COVID-19, response to natural disaster and crisis. How do you see, and you can either in response to typhoons or to this COVID-19 crisis in particular, where do you see peace work being done in the midst of this pandemic? That's perhaps new or different. Christopher asks, what does peace leading mean for the panelists in the context of religion and building conflict, building communities, not just post-conflict, but also conflict prevention? And I'm just adding to that, in this moment, where is peace leading happening in your world? Where are you seeing it?
At least in terms of the pandemic, I'm seeing that in going back to addressing the needs of the people. To prevent conflict, well, in this pandemic, of course, we can see food shortages. We can see chaos happening in different areas. And if you provide the needs of the people, you can avoid this conflicts from happening already. And we've seen many religious organizations do that. We have seen a lot of movement from interfaith organizations providing food for those who needed it. I've seen a lot of our organizations preparing meals, not just for the frontline workers, but we have also supported the poor and even indigenous communities which have been left out. In the Philippines is, I'm not sure if something we can be proud of. We've been having the longest lockdown in the world. We've been on lockdown for more than a year now, and many have lost their jobs and many have went hungry. And you can see it is the religious communities that have been providing for the food and the needs of the people. Even health and sanitation packs, kits are also provided by these communities and organizations. So I think in terms of peace building work and peace leading in this time, it really moves towards addressing the needs of the people. It's looking towards inclusive development, for example. It includes working towards sustainable development. So it has transformed from just preventing conflict into addressing the basic human needs that we have.
Reverend, might I add to that for a second? Just one comment. I think that peace building is about stopping the vilifying and the othering of people. And I think we have no better example of that than the President of the United States, who speaks very eloquently about being a president for the red states and the blue states and the United States. And I think that is a prime example of a leader whose focus is peace in his own country.
Thank you. I'm looking at, we have, I think, time for one more question, and I want to make sure I'm getting to, Christina, there's a great question around your reference to those who were protecting their communities against evil. And Ahmed would like to know more about that, to understand that their connective role between faith communities and public health communities. They were using this idea, this translation, really a vocabulary, but can you say more about that? And where do you see the sort of the theological and religious language being effective on the ground?
So evolutionary psychology tells us that we developed a feeling, for instance, of purity in order to avoid pathogens. So we started to distinguish what is pure and what isn't so we could survive. And then those became moral intuitions. So in the two-way street that is the body and the mind, we came to associate certain moral issues with certain tangible issues. So to give you a simple example, we can be disgusted by a bad smell, but we can also be disgusted by an action taken by a high-ranking official in the United States. We can also aspire to eat pure food by buying only organic food, but we can also aspire to be pure in our mind or in our heart by only reading works that lead us to that purity. In other words, there's a very strong moral, intuitive connection between the way we perceive things. So much so that there's studies that demonstrate that students who sit right next to a bottle of Purell, when they have to make judgments in a test, will make harsher judgments. So much so that a study in 2011 of 1,000 judges determined that the sentencing guidelines for criminals, the first criminal that showed up right after the judge had breakfast, had 65% higher chance of getting a better or milder punishment than the one who showed up a few hours later. That's all to say that even though we like to think that we're all very logical human beings, we function by our sense of what is right and what is wrong. So when it comes to religious language, that comes up a lot. We were talking earlier about the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King's wonderful speech, "I Have a Dream," evokes all of the religious sentiments and all of the oppression that Black people were suffering at the time. And that's what makes him so convincing. So when a pastor uses the word evil, he is putting together the moral intuition of his community in understanding what is evil. And he is bringing to them a way, he's bridging the messages from the Ministry of Health, what they have to do by explaining to their community in words, in terms that immediately evoke a sense of rightness or wrongness. And that's what Perry was talking about with the Black churches while talking about the vaccine inside the houses of worship. It's crucial. And it is so important right now, particularly since we live in such isolated communities, to have people who know the terms that are going to evoke the right sentiments. So that's why I thought the pastor talking about evil was a brilliant way of making his community understand how important it was that they get vaccinated and survive.
Thank you. There are several more wonderful questions, and I apologize to the participants for not being able to get to them. But we are coming to a close, and I want to thank you. I've been delighted to be a part of this conversation, to listen to you, and I'm thankful to Lark and Christopher for inviting all of us to be a part of this. And I want to hand it over to them now to close us out.
Thank you for joining us this evening for our fantastic panel discussion. We appreciate that Dr. I'm sorry, I'm going to say this wrong, Halkitis.
How about Perry?
Yes, Perry, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm dyslexic. For your definitions of resilience and the description of the developmental process at the individual, family, and community levels for adapting behavioral systems, attitudes about experiences, and also your personal anecdotes. Christina, thank you for mentioning that morality binds us and also blinds us, the hierarchy of morality and the role of prayer and community in coping with wellness in Latin America and beyond, as well as the other examples that you mentioned. Renz, thank you for mentioning that religion is a source of hope and comfort in times of crisis, especially in the calamities and the typhoons in the Philippines and during the lockdown, and how youth coalitions can create communities of outreach as interfaith interactions can transform vengeance into forgiveness. We really appreciate that we've had both the opportunity to create space for interfaith dialogue tonight and to listen and understand with equal voice and respect, including some of our disagreements. We appreciate the need that we have to sustain these efforts now and into the future, because as our human needs to respond to crises grow, we must also, as an interfaith network, continue to rise up to meet the challenge. And because grassroots movements are inclusive, promote solidarity, and have a high impact with those limited resources that we've all noted, this will continue to be ever more critical. And we really appreciate your contributions. Thank you so much for coming tonight.
This panel concludes our panel series that we've had all semester on religion and peace building, where we've entertained the relevance of religion in international affairs, the role of religion in liberation theology, and gender, religion, and peace building, along with this discussion we had today on community, building resilient community and peace building. With that, this is also our final religion, law, and diplomacy initiative event of the school year. We've had a very exciting school year. You can check back on our previous events that are uploaded on our religion, law, and diplomacy website. And we encourage you to join our e-list to be appraised and informed of our upcoming events, our fall conference, and everything else that we have in the future. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you to our panelists, to our moderator for joining us today and having this spirited conversation. And we hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Before we leave, Christopher, I saw in the chat that you wanted a panel shot. And since we're all here, if we could all look at can someone take a screenshot? Who can do that?
We'll get a screenshot, and thank you to everybody, and thank you for a really, really spirited panel. It was a pleasure to listen to friends and to RFP member as well. So thank you for all being with us. And also, Chris, I don't mean to correct you, but I will.
Sure.
There's one more event, although not related to the panel series, and that's on April 12th, and it'll be exploring religion and violent extremism. So religious and non-religious forms of violent extremism around the world today, but unrelated to our 4-panel series. Thank you again to everyone.